Welcome back to the Submission Channel as we continue our read along from the Anti-Mary Exposed, Rescuing the Culture from Toxic Femininity. So we left off at chapter 4 and we continue with chapter 5. Chapter 5 speaks of the Anti-Marian architects. Okay? So if this is your first time here in the Submission Channel, what I'm doing is sharing with our viewers books that have inspired me profoundly, that I think would benefit the culture, women, to tune into their feminine that God has created us to have. And I feel like in this day and age, there's not a lot of reading of books. So I figured that maybe a read along would help people because, you can pop in a video, you can drive and listen. You can walk and listen. There's many workout and listen. There's many different things that now in the world, instead of picking up a book and reading, that it would be beneficial for people if they can just listen to me reading it to you. Okay. And then at the end of the chapter, I share like tidbits or anything of my perspective that I feel really touched me profoundly from the chapter. So with that being said, let's begin. Chapter 5, the Anti-Marian Architects. This is a quote from Germaine Greer. A housewife's work has no result. It simply has to be done again. Bringing up children is not a real occupation because children come up just the same, brought up or not. End quote. There is something striking about the speed at which the sexual revolution happened, which feminists often considered to be a sign of divinity behind their effort. The swiftness parallels the rapidness with which the Russian Revolution happened. In just a few short months, in 1918, the Tsar and his descendants were gone, and the Bolsheviks took over. As if overnight, everything changed. A small mob of communists, or in this case, feminists, turned everything on its head. The 1960s were heady days for feminists. Phyllis Chesler argues that feminism happened overnight, saying, and she quotes, "We, who only yesterday have been viewed as cunts, whores, dykes, bitches, witches, and madwomen, we who had been second and third class citizens, had suddenly become players in history. The world would never be the same, and neither would we. Elite and savvy women arrived on the scene at the same time television was swaying the hearts of minds of Western culture. Women like the fiery Betty Friedan, the bold Gloria Steinem, and the saucy Helen Gurley Brown became the it women. They came along and filled the vacuum that had been left by the disintegration of true religious faith in the lives of everyday women. These elite women learned to control and manipulate the message that went out to women in such a way that their legacy holds strong today. There is not one major power corridor inhabited by women in the West, from Hollywood to the fashion industry to politics to book publishing, that is not controlled by radical feminist women. There is much more to their story, however, than just savvy media marketing and a timely message. The darker side to feminist meteoric rise to stardom is rarely discussed. Despite appearances, these women who look to be healthy, sexy, happy, and rich weren't all that the cameras made them out to be. Feminism didn't come out of nowhere. Radical feminism isn't something that happened quite as overnight as it appears. Its roots reach back a long way. 2 world wars prompted the collateral damage that harmed the basic structure of the family and led to the abandonment of God and the eat, drink, and be merry attitude. In some ways, it is hard to overstate the role the world wars played, killing off roughly 37 million people in the Great War, followed by an estimated 80 million in World War II. In addition to the great loss of life, there was also famines, disease, and massive destruction and annihilation of huge swaths of public and private property. This is the backdrop of the lives that emerged in the 1950s. Many people believe that those of us who reject feminism and all its empty promises merely want to return to the 1950s. It's true that the 1950s, unlike any decade since, at least made an effort to keep the veneer of life looking good as the Christian culture that had held society together for centuries began to wane. But the 1950s were no idyllic Camelot. They were simply the initial consequences of the Great Wars and the radical social upheaval and destruction they caused. This incubator of radical feminism is hardly a time to be coveted. A brief look at the women who emerged as the goddesses of the feminist movement makes it clear that none of these women had a happy and carefree childhood. Gloria Steinem had a doting and loving father, but he was ever chasing the next get-rich-quick deal, leaving young Gloria as the caretaker of her bitter and mentally ill mother for many years. Meanwhile, Germaine Greer's attention-loving mother, while her husband was away fighting in the African theater, entertained the troops in Australia. When the doting father returned from the war, the handsome man was so disfigured from battle and starvation that his family had a hard time finding him on the train platform. Germaine described her mom as mean as cat piss, who could bear her, not often, but with passion, even though Germaine was a good child. Germaine concluded that her unaffectionate mother simply didn't like her. Phyllis Chesler has perhaps been the most outspoken about the resentment she held towards her own mother. She criticized me constantly, yelled at me a lot, hit me sometimes, and always threatened to turn me over to my father for more serious discipline. Later in life, Chesler realized that her mother suffered from mental illness. Betty Friedan and her mother would rage at each other. Her mother, a rare beauty who looked like she stepped out of a magazine, was frustrated with Betty, who seemed to work at being ugly. Quote, I was very dominated by my mother. She was very critical of me and made me feel very insecure. End quote. Betty hated her mother's phoniness, so she did the opposite, developing acerbic and rough ways of communicating with just about anyone. A psychologist and author of 17 books, Chesler seems to have dismissed a remarkable piece of evidence about feminism's source, the embattled relationship almost all of these women had with their parents, especially their mothers. These founders of feminism, whom Chesler dubs the Lost Girls, were women from broken homes who carried around deep mother wounds inflicted by little to no emotional support and physical affection. They matured physically, but somewhere on the inside they remained little girls. Their thirst to fill this gap was displayed in their rampant homosexuality and in their infantile effort to ignore the problems they were creating through their groundbreaking behavior. Quote, we are these women our parents warned us against, and we are proud. End quote. boasted Gloria Steinem. Yes, the era was full of sexual abuse and social inequalities, but their answer to fix them didn't help. Quote, "We picketed, marched, protested, sat in, and famously took over offices and buildings, helped women obtain illegal abortions, joined consciousness raising groups, learned about orgasms, condemned incest, rape, sexual harassment, and domestic violence, organized speakouts, crisis hotlines, and shelters for battered women, and came out as lesbians." End quote. The appearance of trying to help every woman who was treated unjustly provided much of the fuel to the cause. Who wouldn't want to help battered wives or a single mother who struggles to make ends meet? Their problem solving, however, through promiscuity, abortion, lesbianism, goddess worship, astrology charts, divorce, and drugs, was like adding gas to the fire of these social problems. Because of their brokenness, as Chesler explains, they found it intoxicating. Quote, "Radical feminism ideas and activism are a bit like LSD. So many women became high at the same time that suddenly the world became psychedelically clear and all the lost girls found themselves and each other." End quote. The sisterhood bonded these outcasts together, linked by common mania, but also because they needed each other, particularly in the darker days before the matriarchy had any success. Gloria Steinem once said, quote, "Any woman who chooses to behave like a full human being should be warned that the armies of the status quo will treat her as something of a dirty joke. She will need her sisterhood." End quote. More than just close friendships, the sisterhood became a place of pro-life rating lesbian relationships, a cabal to solidify the groupthink of the women's movement, and even operated like a coven because of the rampant witchcraft and goddess worship among the members. Like everything else in the women's movement, these were not typical types of sisterly love and affection. Quote, "We were all lost in a dream, but we have never been so awake. Women who were once invisible to each other were now the only visible creatures," end quote, said Chesler. Quote, "Women who used to see one another as wicked stepsisters had magically transformed into fairy godmothers. I was as foolish as only a young dreamer could be," she added. "But I was no longer alone. Now there was a we, and we wanted to end the subjugation of women. Now," end quote. Because of their broken relationships with their mothers and the radical break they made with any type of tradition, even first wave feminist, Chesler said, quote, "Psychologically, we second wavers had no feminist foremothers and no biological mothers. We only had sisters," end quote. Kate Millett, High Priestess. In 1970, the academically successful but mentally unstable Kate Millett found herself on the cover of Time magazine with the title "The Politics of Sex, Kate Millett and Women's Lib," featuring her book Sexual Politics. Considered groundbreaking, Millett quickly became the intellectual force behind radical feminism. Time called her the High Priestess of the movement and her book, its Bible. The New York Times also called her book the Bible of Women's Liberation, and a remarkable document because it analyzes the need and nature of sexual liberation while itself displaying the virtues of intellectual and emotional openness and lovingness. Time also called her the Karl Marx of the women's movement because her book laid out a course of Marxism 101 for women. Her thesis, The family is a den of slavery with the man as the bourgeois and the women and children as the proletariat. Proletariat. Sorry, proletariat. A few months after Miller appeared on Time's cover, the magazine ran a second article about her, this time less laudatory. The article, entitled Women's Lib, A Second Look, attacked Millet for her bisexuality. The fame and the shame, many people say, destroyed her. Her personality wasn't strong enough for the glowing limelight, followed by the dark scrutiny. Kate had a shitload of charm, and in the beginning a commanding presence, Phyllis Chesler recalls. Quote, but she also had periods in which she didn't sleep, raged at others, attempted suicide, and exploited her groupies, all the while feeling victimized by them, which she was. She couldn't be counted on to remain lucid at a press conference, and she also fell in love and tried to have her way quite aggressively with woman after woman, including me. End quote. Millett died in 2017, but her sister Mallory Millett has started speaking up about the irreparable damage Kate did to Western culture through the popularization of her dark and demented work. Mallory attests to the fact that Kate's mania wasn't brought on by the Time articles, but had pre-existed her fame since childhood. Quote, she was the most disturbed, megalomaniacal, evil, and dishonest person I have ever known, Mallory said. She tried to kill me so many times that it's now an enormous blur of traumatizing horrors. She was a sadist, a torturer, a deeply ingrained bully who took immense pleasure in hurting others. What the Time article did do is destroyed her marriage. Despite being seduced by a female professor in college, Kate had given up her lesbian lifestyle when she married Fumio Yoshimura, and for 17 years they had a happy marriage. After the Time article was published, Kate was ambushed at an evening church meeting by a cabal of lesbians at the church, who thought they were being left out of the movement's limelight. To defend herself against the charges, Kate confessed that she had once been a lesbian, unaware that 2 Time reporters were among the throng. This was what prompted the second Time article, but it also led Kate back to promiscuity as a lesbian and the ruin of her life with Fumio. It was something that she would regret for the rest of her life. End quote. Kate's relationship and the years of heartache and regret it brought to both spouses was hardly an isolated case. The movement destroyed relationship after relationship with the promise of free love and liberation, where bodies were used for amusement and vows and promises were quickly tossed aside. Mallory, who spent a period devoted to her sister Kate and her radical ideas before returning to the Catholic faith of their childhood, eventually left Kate's inner circle when things just got too weird. But she spent enough time with women in the movement to see its underbelly. Mallory has dark stories that make it clear these women were clearly involved in the occult with a Marxist twist. Quote, it was 1969 and she took me to a meeting at her friend Lila Karp's place in Greenwich Village, Mallory explains. At a consciousness raising, an idea imported from Mao's China, 12 women gathered at a large table. They opened with a type of litany from the Catholic Church, but this time it was Marxism, the church of the left. This litany was chronicled in the introduction, but it's worth repeating. Why are we here today? The chairwoman asked. To make revolution, they answered. What kind of revolution? She replied. The cultural revolution, they chanted. And how do we make cultural revolution? She demanded. By destroying the American family, they answered. How do we destroy the family? She came back. By destroying the American patriarch, they cried exuberantly. And how do we destroy the American patriarch? She probed. By taking his power. And how do we do that? By destroying monogamy, they shouted. And how do we destroy monogamy? By promoting promiscuity, eroticism, prostitution, abortion, and homosexuality, they resounded. End quote. Such antics might seem insignificant except for the fact that all of these goals have been achieved. The rhetoric used to convince women to engage in these things seems ridiculous now, but somehow it was compelling then. The last straw for Mallory, when she knew she had to get away from Kate and her croonies, was when Kate aggressively tried to get Mallory to go to bed with her. But the craziness didn't stop with Kate. Quote, Shulamith Firestone called pregnancy barbaric, preferred artificial reproduction, and imagined a utopia in which children, like Eris, would roam freely throughout the world. End quote. Mallory adds, quote, Greer, with a PhD from Cambridge, encouraged women to taste their own menstrual blood and discouraged them from partnering monogamously. Women, Greer claimed, have very little idea of how much men hate them. End quote. These ideas extended beyond their little troop of women through the women's studies programs they helped establish across the country. In those women's studies classes, a young impressionable girl, Mallory explains, will be told, be an outlaw, be a damned outlaw. Every law was concocted by a dead white man. Be a slut and be proud of it. Millet and her crew of 11 young women lived by this very philosophy. They started calling themselves sluts and engaged in orgies and every other sort of thing that captured the imagination. The most harrowing story in Mallory's memory is of a dinner party on a Halloween night at Kate's loft apartment. Upon entering, there was a long, low table with 12 placements topped by a plate, a bowl of water, and a sharp knife resting on it. In front of each plate setting were 12 completely naked women, sitting cross-legged on cushions. The naked woman at the end of the table was wrapped by a live 10-foot boa constrictor. Dumbstruck and appalled, Mallory and her friend watched in horror. They were invited to join in the ritual, but they told Kate that they were just there to observe, which seemed to suit Kate since they were only willing to take off their shoes. As they took their eyes off to resume the ritual, Mallory explained, we tiptoed in our shoes and crept out, running down those flight of stairs like bats out of hell. My feet barely touched the steps until we burst out into the Bowery, shaking and huffing in shock and in terror. Mallory marvels at how it happened, how this anti-apostolic crowd succeeded so wildly in their ragtag efforts from start to finish. Quote, how could 12 American women, who were the most respectable types imaginable, clean and privileged graduates of esteemed institutions, Columbia, Radcliffe, Smith, Wesley, Vassar, the uncle of one was a Secretary of War under Franklin Roosevelt, plot such a thing, she asked. Most had advanced degrees and appeared cogent, bright, reasonable, and good. How did these girls rationally believe that they could succeed with such vicious grandiosity, and why? End quote. Clearly, there had to be more to their motivation and Kate's mania. Their adherence to Marxism and their engagement in the occult made it a perfect storm of destruction. It was an anti-Marian bomb that is still exploding through Western culture. Quote, I came to see all this lesbianism, witchcraft, atheist, atheist, atheistic politics as a psychotic dimension. It is just plain crazy to convince women that not only is it good to murder your own child in your womb, but it is imperative that you buck up and have the courage to do it. Their argument for doing it was that men were killers, so we must be like them. We'll never see equality with men if we can't prove ourselves capable of killing. There was a deadly concoction of their own twisted ideology along with the inflated fears of the population explosion. These women were convinced that they had to do it for the sake of their own future, but also to save our planet. End quote. Mallory says that Kate's friends were always covering for her, getting her out of mental institutions and other tight spots. Even after her death, they still covered up for her radical mental health issues while insisting on her genius. Seen here in this short eulogizing quote Gloria Steinem emailed to the New York Times after Kate's death, which quotes, Kate was brilliant, deep, and uncompromising. She wrote about the politics of male dominance, of owning women's bodies as the means of reproduction, and made readers see this as basic to hierarchies of race and class. She was not just talking about unequal pay, but about women hatred in the highest places and among the most admired intellectuals. As Andrea Dworkin said, the world was asleep, but Kate Millett woke it up. End quote. It was quite a rude awakening. Free Love and the Lavender Menace. Men, as part of the patriarchy, were also the direct targets for radical feminists. They argued that men were the ones who had created the world wars, so men must be stopped using any means possible, including sex-selective abortions to thin out their numbers. Fewer men meant less harm would afflict the planet. Men were the enemy, therefore monogamous heterosexual relationships were frowned upon, while promiscuity of any stripe was lauded. With their elevated sense of sisterhood, their own brokenness, and experience as lost girls, the highest ideal of feminism became lesbianism. A young Gloria Steinem wondered aloud when she too would finally be attracted to another woman. At some point, she and many other feminists like her made a transition from male lovers to lesbians. It was viewed as a rite of passage to wear the feminist badge, and instead of women jumping out of cakes for stag parties, they engaged in their own forms of adult entertainment, too sordid to mention here. As an octogenarian, Steinem boasted that she had become gender neutral, as much female as she is male, or perhaps no gender at all. In itself, quote, in itself, homosexuality is as limiting as heterosexuality. The ideal should be to be capable of loving a woman or man, either a human being, without feeling fear, restraint, or obligation, end quote, wrote Simone de Beauvoir, apparently in a way that was compelling among these self-proclaimed misfits. Quote, a gender-equal society would be the one where the word gender does not exist, where everyone can be themselves, end quote, said Steinem. Kate Millett, oscillating between bisexuality and lesbianism at different stages of her life, weighed in on the important role of that homosexuality could play for the revolution. Quote, a sexual revolution begins with the emancipation of women, who are the chief victims of patriarchy, and also with the ending of homosexual oppression. End quote. She didn't limit herself to adults, but thought intergenerational sex was important. She was sympathetic to abolishing the age consent laws so that children could also express their sexuality or have it expressed upon them. Millett added that, quote, one of children's essential rights is to express themselves sexually, probably primarily with each other, but with adults as well, and that the sexual freedom of children is an important part of the sexual revolution. If you don't change the social condition of children, you still have an inescapable inequality, end quote. Cosmopolitan, Playboy for Playgirls. Helen Gurley Brown, Kate Millett's popular opposite personality-wise, has undoubtedly surpassed Kate's influence as founder of Cosmopolitan magazine. Gurley Brown, author of Sex and the Single Girl, was fascinated by the success of Playboy and decided to make her own version of it. She got pointers from Hugh Hefner and followed the Playboy model as closely as she could, right down to using the same writing agents and layout model. It quickly became the hottest women's magazine in the nation. Revenues from the magazine went from $601,000 in 1964 to $47.7 million in 1985, much of which came from advertising from the now $4 billion birth control industry. While others were struggling to get advertisers, Cosmo had no problem getting backers. Other magazines quickly followed the Cosmo model to the point where there was very little difference between self-glamour and Cosmo content. Cosmo was all about selling a lifestyle. Motherhood was out. Sex was in. Gurley Brown's motto was, quote, hard work and sex will set you free as long as you don't have children, end quote. Even the throw pillow on a couch in the magazine's lobby said approvingly, good girls go to heaven, bad girls go everywhere. As part of this lifestyle, a Cosmo girl could be anything she wanted, except a virgin or a mother. She could be a lesbian, a brothel owner, or a stripper, but she could not remain a virgin or become a mother. Cosmo girls run roughshod over their fertility, although I'm sure this was never part of their advertising slogans. Tough as a whore was never meant to be a compliment, yet the feminists turned it into just that. Sue Ellen Bowder, who started off on staff and then freelanced for Cosmopolitan for over 2 decades, was a dutiful writer of fiction for the popular magazine. Most readers didn't realize, however, that she was making stories up. Many of the alleged real people we wrote about in the magazine were entirely fictitious. The Cosmo Girl was not a real person, but a persona, a mask the single girl, lonely and alone in the world, could put on to turn herself into the object of a man's sexual fantasy. The typical Cosmo Girl had a glamour job, traveled a lot, and spent her hard-earned cash on pricey commodities to support her self-centered lifestyle. Make no mistake, Bowder is quickly to add, we're not talking here about what's popularly called the spin. This was hardcore sex revolution propaganda masquerading as fluff, end quote. Bowder eventually converted to Catholicism, but that was after the damage was done as a Cosmo writer. She makes it clear that they weren't doing women or men any favors, despite appearances. Quote, as we visibly pretended to set women sexually free from their biology via the pill and abortion, we were invisibly catering to and even helping to create millions of sexually troubled, insecure, confused women who were likely to attract equally confused, insecure men. End quote. Girly Brown's influence didn't end with the magazine. In 1986, the magazine mogul invited the editors from 13 different magazines, including Good Housekeeping, Redbook, Harper's Elle, Savvy, Family Circle, and others, to a meeting. Quote, Ellen spoke at the meeting, Botter explains, and the editors agreed to run pro-abortion articles in their March 1987 issues. Among the articles that appeared in Cosmopolitan that month were Abortion, Your Right Under Attack, Choice, Separating Myth from Fact, My Illegal Abortion, and an article on why 8 famous women were pro-choice, end quote. These women colluded in promoting pro-choice articles to soften American women to abortion. Magazines, starting with Cosmo and all the others following suit, were the sales of arms of Kate Millett's litany. It was Girly Brown and her minions that were selling the American public on promiscuity, eroticism, prostitution, abortion, and homosexuality, while laughing all the way to the bank. Wounds That Won't Heal. At the end of her book, Phyllis Chesler lists the many feminists for whom she still holds great affection, even though they have passed on. Women such as Kate Millett, Andrea Dworkin, Rivka Haught, and Jill Johnston. Chesler worked with many other women, scores of whom didn't make the list because they betrayed her and the sisterhood at some point. The other striking thing about Chesler's close cadre of sisterhood friends was how many of them had severe mental health issues. Quote, I realized that just as I was once afraid to admit, even to myself, that mental illness plagued my high-functioning mother and members of my family, so too have I denied the extent to which many of the most charismatic and original feminist thinkers were mentally ill, she wrote. I don't mean neurotic, difficult, anxious, or eccentric. I mean clinically schizophrenic or manic depressive, suicidal, addicted to drugs or alcohol, or afflicted with a personality disorder. End quote. It is not clear if any of these women finally came to terms with their mothers and found the healing they needed from their deep wounds. One of the tough realities of parental wounds is that the child, who loves the parent despite deep hurt, doesn't want to go to that place of accusing the parent of terrible things. George MacDonald, who believed that Christ could redeem even Lilith, spoke to this reality in his book, Lilith, a Romance. At one point in the novel, Lona, the daughter of Lilith and Adam, and her community are forced to fight Lilith's aggressive, murderous village. Before the battle, Lona, speaking about her mother, says, I would give my life to have my mother. She might kill me if she liked. I should just kiss her and die. It is the static nature of a child to love her mother no matter what. In fact, it isn't hard to imagine the aborted children offering these sentiments to the mothers that will never hold them. Read it again. I would give my life to have my mother. She might kill me if she liked. I should just kiss her and die. The lost girls, these girls who were never affirmed properly by their parents, who looked under every rock in every dark place for the answers to their questions, to affirm their lives, bring them peace, and flourish as authentic women, are the ones who have shaped the large majority of our culture dialogue. Ultimately, their search has been fruitless. Fruitless not because they didn't achieve their goals. The demonic desires chanted by Kate Millett and her anti-apostles have been realized through the victorious cultural revolution, but because it has only been destructive and debasing, not constructive and elevating. They destroyed the family out of hostility. As Father George Rutler says, hostility to truth is nurtured by the love of lies, and the lies of the matriarchy sound empowering and liberating. The matriarchy sought to make the world a more comfortable place by unleashing the sensual above the rational and the tolerance over principle, but a terrible cost to everyone. Our world has become an orphanage, which is what happens when we get rid of the cross and the women who stood by it. That is the conclusion of our chapter 5, which is the anti-Marian architects, which gives a deep and definitive root to the anti-Marian spirit. So like the anti-patriarch to the feminism movement, to all of these liberal thoughts and processes, to the free love, to the what really struck me was when they spoke of the litany that they had, and something that they repeated and chanted and said to themselves, which is to make this revolution where they destroy the man. You know, essentially they destroy the family and the patriarch. Why? To take this power and this mindset that in reality is creation. That's my perspective of it, right? Like the way that the Lord created man and women to be, and the roles that he assigned them to have, and this mission that they have been given in being united as one, in having this family unit, in having monogamy, in having these things that through the evil that's in the world, right? Through these movements and these thought processes that feed the lie. The last sentence said it good, like the last paragraph said it good. Place unleashing the sensual above the rational. So unleashing sensuality, which we see now in every sense of the word, how sensual tops and trumps rational, how there's tolerance, we tolerate many things over the principality of things, and it's come to a terrible cost, and we see the effects of this now in this day and age in 2024. Now we see the effect of how the longevity of this movement, where it has gotten to us at this, where it has brought us to at this point, which to me is the destruction of family. The empowerment of women has us believing that we are better than men, seeking the position of man, diminishing man, feminizing man, empowering ourselves as men, thinking that we know better, that we can do better, that we don't need the male form in our lives, destroying the family, having us in positions of being fathers, when in reality we don't belong in that position. The father belongs in that position. Therefore, creating generations of confused children that don't have a definitive mother and father role in their families, separation of families, which create additional families, and this cycle of brokenness continues. So it's broken families with growing new families, breaking those families, and continuing the cycle. So we see a lot of divorce, a lot of separation. We don't even see marriage now. It's like normal to have a whole family without having the foundation of marriage in the picture. Not to mention the homosexuality and it mentioned early in the chapter how the mentality of this woman was to not have gender at all, to not have gender be a thing, because even in the term of homosexuality, you're limiting someone to the entity of who they can be. So it shows that this ideology that we're currently living now, this gender ideology and the things that they're pushing on children and all of these things are things that have already been into play over 50 years ago, right? So it shows that now it's like full bloom of something that someone started in a thought process that they weren't even thinking clearly because they were going off their emotions and what they were feeling and through their experiences. And I like the very last section that says wounds that won't heal. And particularly it said, it's not clear if any of these women finally came to terms with their mothers and found the healing that they needed from their deep wounds. One of the tough realities of parental wounds is that the child who loves the parent despite their deep hurt doesn't want to go to that place of accusing the parent of terrible things. So it's not acknowledging that these are the things that have hurt me that my parents have done, right? And these are the wounds that I have that I need, to the last sentence, that I need the cross and the women who stood by it to be there. Many of us don't want to embrace the cross, the thing that brings us to suffering, the one thing that brings us to this place that like marks our life forever and leads us to operate from this broken place, right? And for me, I like really resonated in this chapter on all of the things that I was taught as a young woman, right? Which is an effect of what my mom was taught from her mom, which is an effect of what was going on in those times, right? So this was like the cluster time, the ideal time when this was the movement of the grandmothers that they were listening to, that they were experiencing from their moms handed down in their families, in their generation, and they passed it down to their kids. And then our parents, I'm 44. My mom was born in 63. So our parents went through these things, endured these traumas. These things were not talked about. These things were not addressed. These things were not conversations that were had. These wounds were not things that were healed and hence passed on to our generation. And for me, it was an awakening moment that I've had this encounter with Christ, where he has found me, where he has brought me out of the mud, right? I always envisioned this reading that from Isaiah, where like he references a rock, right? Like I'm this rock in this mud, and the Lord picks me up and wants to build this new foundation with me. And he brings me this enlightenment only through his word and only through walking with him and this journey along with him that I've been on for now like 7 years, and brings me to this enlightenment of what is it that has brought me the suffering to lead the life that I led. Because I led a life always searching for something, always searching for love, for fulfillment, and never found it. Because everything that you find or search to find fulfillment in that is not rooted and based in the love of God, you're never going to find fulfillment in. Because you find fulfillment, joy, purpose, all of the above good things you find in that who created you. You find that connection in the relationship with God. So not until I was enlightened by this to see that these wounds that I had from my parental parents were just generational things that were passed on and passed on and passed on and passed on and were never healed. And I too, myself, passed on to my children, right? So the generational curses are real, and these wounds that we're not willing to confront because we don't want to place blame, or we don't want to place judgment, essentially, because when you're telling someone they've hurt you or they've done something to wound you, it's essentially offensive to the individual that's listening to it. But it's a reality, and it's a reality that if we don't encounter it and we don't confront it with the assistance, the love, the mercy, the the healing that comes from the Lord. We don't receive that guidance. We don't receive the wisdom. We don't receive the knowledge. We don't receive the things that we need from Him in order to heal these wounds and confront these things with Him, right? Because only with the presence of Him through this cross that is given to us to bring us closer to Him can we not connect the dots and move forward in the healing process, because He's the one that brings us to that healing. You can try to do it on your own. You can try to do it with therapy. You can try to do it with these things that are worldly, and they help. I've done therapy myself. They help, but they don't. It's like I'm a nurse by trade, right? So it's like having like one of those deep rooted wounds that you need to heal from the inside out. It's not like a band-aid or a stitch and that's it. No, it's like this deep, you gotta pack it, and keep packing it and cleaning it out and packing it and cleaning it out, so it like heals from the very inside all the way out. The only one that can heal those kind of wounds is God. You can do all the therapy in the world that you want, and I stand by this. You can do all that you want, but you're only surfacing, you're only like putting a scab on it. You're not truly healing the wound. The pus and all that stuff is still on the inside. You're not truly recovering from that. And all it takes is an event, is a word, is something said, is a conversation to be had. It's a trigger to come up for all that to burst open and to start oozing all over again. The Lord is the one that comes with His power, with His word, with His, like I said, knowledge, with the things that you need in order to understand, with His understanding, not your own understanding, to heal those things. And the lie that has been passed on is that you, in your own power, in your own actions, in your own doing, in your own searching, in your own justification, in your own self, because everything that when you point to yourself and the things that you've done, you think you can justify the things of what I can get to make me happy. And you're never going to fulfill that, because these are wounds that only God can heal. And for me, it was a monumental chapter for me to read at the time that I was reading it, to let me know that, and to bring me to a place that I can be open for Him to lead me in the direction to heal the things of my relationships with my parents that I needed to heal. And then in return, allow me to acknowledge the things that I've done as a mom, to bring me to a place where I can seek the forgiveness and acknowledgement to my children for the things that I've done to hurt them. Because it's not easy to acknowledge that you've done things to really deeply wound and hurt your children, but they deserve that much too. So it's the acknowledgement, it's the mercy, it's the forgiveness that the Lord gives you, the enlightenment that He gives you in order to acknowledge these things and then move forward into the healing process that He leads in the things that you need healed within you, and the ability to give you to pursue the healing in others as well. So thank you very much for tuning in to chapter 5. It was very profound. It was very detailed. It had a lot of information that many of us weren't even aware of. The Cosmo thing blew me away, right? And how they like made fake articles. I used to love those stories. But it brings us to this reality that not everything that is put out there is one factual or true good for us to be influenced by. So we have to be mindful of what are the things that we're listening to, what are the things that we're watching, what are the things that we are allowing our mind to ingest, what are the things that are going to bring us closer to God and the way that He wants us to lead our lives, and what are the things that we need to totally separate from and detach ourselves from, so that way we can lead the lives that God is calling us to. So thank you for tuning in. I'll see you next time for chapter 6. Have a good one. Don't forget to hit subscribe, like, and share with somebody that you think might enjoy it. Appreciate you. Bye.